there's a great responsibility that goes with being armed and being an armed culture. Excalibur as an example, as an allegory, as a parable, as a parallel. Let me go over, Roland and the whole archetype of the French mythos and the Dark Tower. You've got the British mythos, the Welsh myth that comes out of course, King Arthur. That was a true person, but went into myth and legend. And other cultures have their mythos. But the Second Amendment is Excalibur in that it's only there when you need it for defense against tyranny. And then when you have to pull the sword, there's a great responsibility that goes with being armed and being an armed culture. Because in those old feudal systems, everybody but the nobility was disarmed. That's what feudalism was. And in fact, they didn't have feudalism in the Arthurian time in Albion. Everybody was armed. And it was when the Saxons got conquered by the Norse in 1100 and change, by William the Conqueror, that then the true feudalism began under the Viking kings. So you have to understand this myth goes back to when everybody was armed, but to pull the sword of kingship, you had to have the birthright, and that's a spiritual birthright. And so now we have this, one of the only countries where we're still armed, passed on to us by our ancestors. Excalibur, or Caliburn, is the legendary sword of King Arthur, sometimes attributed with magical powers associated with the rightful sovereignty of Great Britain. And again, it's the original Welsh system. Sometimes Excalibur and the Sword of the Stone, the proof of Arthur's lineage, are said to be the same weapon. And then it goes on with their Gaelic name. And then there's the forms and etymologies of that. But the reason this is important is America is hated by the globalists because the people that set up America believed that they were actually setting up the new system of human empowerment and freedom. And so, again, it's that archetypal birthright of pulling the sword from the stone that's handed down to you, but that most people walk by and just think of as myth, even though it's sitting right there in the middle of the forest for all of us to see. People can't pull it for generations, so they just begin to ignore it and say no man can pull it. But you've got to be pure of heart. You've got to realize that all of you that are listeners to this show that are called to fight globalism and called to expose forced abortion and all these great tyrannies, you have pulled the sword. You have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and that's your true birthright. And God's forbearance or forgiveness, like the blood on the mantle or the blood on the door frame, so the angel of death passes you by. But you've got to pull the sword. The sword is waiting. Many of you were born with this birthright. You love God, but you are a passerby. You are not truly living yet because you haven't taken on the weight of the sword. You have to pull it, and then you have to be able to hold it, and then you have to be able to wield it. And it doesn't mean you're ever going to wield it perfectly, but you've got to be wanting to do good and not be a coward and not care what the globalists say about you and the media says about you, and then you can swing the sword. And that's why the globalists hate us. I've been on air 22 years, and Infowars has pulled the sword of Excalibur. We have the sword. Doesn't mean we're even worthy fully to have the sword, but I have the sword. You have the sword. But Infowars is the very manifestation of pulling Excalibur from the stone. And that's why the enemy's scared, because we've pulled the sword, ladies and gentlemen. We can barely hold it up right now in our journey, learning to wield the power. But all over the world, the evil has intensified to such a point that good is now coming back into the universe, back into the world, back into our plane. Because people have gotten humble. They have repented. They have gotten in front of God at 3 a.m. and prayed for deliverance from this. And there will be persecution and tribulation and bad things happening to you when you pull that sword. But what comes, bondage and enslavement and abject evil, is much worse if you don't pull the sword and stand. And when I say pull the sword, I mean that metaphysically, spiritually, to stand against the enemy. Not to ridicule those that try to stand against the enemy and who stumble sometimes, but still try at the great deeds. But to join us on the field. Excalibur is waiting. One more quote of Alexander Solzhenitsyn from his Nobel Prize-winning Gulag Archipelago. Then he realized we were going the same way as communist Russia and went back to Russia to try to reform it, which he had some success on. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was in decades in a forced labor camp, and how we burned in the camps later thinking, what would things have been like if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive and had to say goodbye to his family, or if during periods of mass arrest, as for example in Leningrad, when the arrests a quarter of the entire city, people had not simply sat there in their lairs, pawing with terror at every bang on the downstairs door, at every step on the staircase, but had understood they had nothing left to lose and had boldly set up in the downstairs hall an ambush of a half dozen people with axes, hammers, pokers, whatever else was at hand. The organs, that's the systems, the machine, would have quickly have suffered a shortage of officers and transport, and notwithstanding all of Stalin's thirst for blood, I added that, the cursed machine would have ground to a halt if we didn't love freedom enough. And even more, we had no awareness of the real situation. We purely and simply deserved everything that happened afterward. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago, 1918 to 1956. I read the book, the whole thing's that well written. Had a lot of time to think about it, decades in a forced labor camp. In frozen Siberia. Visited upon them by the company that previously founded Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs funded the Bolshevik Revolution. That's public. And Goldman Sachs is funding taking your guns and breaking up your family and screwing your kids up as best they can, sexualizing them at age 5.
In ancient times, man roamed the earth in a constant state of hunting or being hunted. Introducing Caveman, where cutting-edge science meets ancient super nutrients. Secure your bottle right now at InfoWarsStore.com.